I'd just like to start off today touching on truth and reconciliation. I think is an issue which has both personal and professional dimensions. And towards that, at the institutional level, I'd like to acknowledge the land that we are situated on today. And I think this is particularly important given how central land and our relationship to it is to issues of sustainability. So the University of Alberta recognizes and respectively acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota, Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. So just a little bit about the speaker series. So this talk today is part of the Sustainability Council lecture series. And throughout the academic year, the council hosts interdisciplinary scholars, professionals, and activists who engage with the issue of sustainability, climate change, and the environment broadly. So the lectures are usually bi-weekly, and they'll be continuing throughout this year, as we saw from the schedule that was up earlier. So a note for the benefit of those who could not be with us today, it will be recorded so that they can follow up and benefit from it later on. It will be posted on the YouTube channel. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Potvin. So merci beaucoup d'être ici avec nous aujourd'hui. It's been a long time since I've had a lot of French surrounding me, and within my brain, I spent some time in Montreal as a postdoc, and it was my pleasure to meet Catherine at that time. Since then, she's done a lot more in terms of her career and her research, and it's a pleasure to introduce her today. She's currently a professor in the Department of Biology at McGill University in Montreal and holds the Canada Research Chair on Climate Change Mitigation and Tropical Forests. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and presently her research focuses on the need to reduce deforestation and forest degradation in the tropics. And she's been involved, in tropics and working in tropical forests for a long time, also pioneering research on the relationship between tree diversity and ecosystem function, establishing the Sardinia tree diversity in Panama decades ago. So she's worked with the Embera people of Panama since 1994, so for a long time already. And their long-term collaboration has led her to develop participatory approaches that integrate the human dimension in biological analysis. And I think she's certainly a leader in this field in the idea that we work with communities, not in communities, as scientists that are coming from locations and places of privilege. She served as Panama's negotiator of REDD in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change from 2005 to 2009, and currently leads the Sustainable Canada Dialogues, an initiative that mobilizes 80 scholars from across Canada to propose a blueprint for Canada's transition to a low carbon economy. So bonjour, Catherine, and again, thank you for being here today with us. And I'll give the floor to you.
Okay, bonjour, hello, it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm gonna just share my screen. Please let me know when you see it. I guess it's fine now. Let's change the mode. When I decided, when I was invited to give this talk, I gave it a bit of a thought, and beginning of term, everybody's very busy. So I decided to give you maybe a bit more of a national geographic talk than I normally do. And that's why my title is A Visit to an Ancient Tropical Forest. But of course, I will take advantage of the topic, the slides, the data to talk about forest and carbon, which is my bread, butter, and my obsession in a sense, because there's a lot that we can learn, about climate change and about us when we think about tropical forests. So much of my work is in Panama, but I would like to spend the few first slides of this talk just going over background. In a sustainability talk, you never know how much people know about these specific technical issues. So the intro is meant to bring us to a sort of a common understanding. So I'm sure you're all aware of the global carbon cycle. I assume that you're seeing my mouse as I move it on my screen, and I hope it's the case. If it is,
you look and sound good.
Okay, so you know that the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration is going up. We have a good handle on measuring that. There's a lot of observatory in the planet. The most famous one is in Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And we've been able to measure this increment in atmospheric carbon dioxide. So we're trying to understand this global carbon cycle. We know there are some natural cycles. So the vegetation, the land, the plants on the land, and the ocean, both the algae in the ocean, but also dissolved inorganic carbon, are both important stocks. They are represented here by the size of those circles. And they are also important fluxes. So the vegetation, terrestrial vegetation in particular, is a very important flux. So the plants take up a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. I know I'm talking to you at University of Calgary, but I like to say that, in fact, the only technology that is available today to be deployed at the large scale to take up carbon dioxide from the oxygen is photosynthesis. And that's why it's really important to factor this in our climate policies. So probably you're all familiar with this curve that shows that over time, since the Industrial Revolution, but more in the past decades, the atmospheric CO2 concentration is increasing. But you're probably less familiar with the red oscillation. I like to say this is the breathing of the planet, but in fact, this is the signature of forests. So when the CO2, these are annual cycle, and every year when it's the winter in the Northern Hemisphere, atmospheric CO2 concentration is higher than the summer in the Northern Hemisphere. So this differential here is the effect of the forest of Canada, of Russia, of Europe, the effect they have on taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We don't see in this the effect of tropical forests because they are evergreen, so they act on climate similarly, but year round. So just for you to capture the fact that forests are so important that we can detect their action on the atmosphere from, just looking at the concentration of CO2 in the air. This is another way of understanding the effect of forests and their link between forests and climate change. So this map here shows you the Amazon with different countries in different colors. Here you have the entire country flux from fossil fuel. This is the flux due to deforestation, so cutting down forests. And this is the flux of the forest taking up carbon dioxide. So in reality, over the past decades, the forests de facto have been mitigating climate change. So the forests have been a big help for humanity, taking up carbon constantly and therefore reducing by about half the impact of the emissions, anthropogenic emissions. So there's a new buzzword around, and even it invited itself in the federal political campaign. It's the word natural climate solution. It was coined by a scientist named Bronson Griscom in a paper published in the Proceeding of the Royal Society. And basically, these scientists make the argument that plants, forests in particular, but land use, so agricultural soil and forest soil, would be able to take up probably about 30% of the emissions that we need to reduce in order to maintain the planetary global temperature at about 2 degrees Celsius. So basically, they're arguing that the way we use, the way we manage, the way we use our agricultural land, the way we manage our forests is a part of the solution to climate change. And this provides the context in which I've been working in the past decades. The reason why I work with trees, I guess if I was not a biologist, if I was an engineer, maybe I would work on electric trains to equip Canada with that. If I was a policy maker, I would certainly work on climate policy. But because I'm a biologist, I turn to the tropics, and this figure shows why. The stocks of carbon of tropical forest is only equal to what's happening in the boreal moist, but that's really something going on the underneath the ground with all the peat soil, which has accumulated a lot of carbon. So the tropics have a very high reservoir for carbon. It's mostly in the above ground biomass of trees, so the standing biomass. And one advantage over, I think, the boreal moist is the fast cycling or the fast growth of tropical trees. So if you're looking to solution for the climate crisis, forests grow faster in the tropics than you can store carbon in the soils of temperate or boreal zones. I just want to make it just a little side, here to bring to your attention a very cool paper that was published very shortly, just a month ago. And it's a paper that looks at natural climate solutions for Canada. So if you are, wondering, what can we do in Canada, really the biggest potential for storing carbon currently is in the agricultural sector rather than the forestry sector, again, because those trees we have don't grow so fast. So there's a fundamental difference between the tropical system and the temporal system in, taking advantage of the land to store carbon. So where do I stand? Charles introduced me with quite a lot of detail, but let me self-define who I am. I heard somebody once saying, if you know where I sit, you know where I stand. So I mostly work in Panama. I've been working there for a long time. And I'm interested in both the conservation of natural forests, the reconstruction of forest carbon stock by planting forests, and core to my work is my relationship with Indigenous people in Panama. So I've grown to be as concerned almost with Indigenous livelihoods and rights than I am with, the biological aspect of my work. So I would say I'm very, very interdisciplinary by now. The overarching question that we're trying to maybe pursue in my lab is to reduce uncertainties around, one part of this global carbon cycle. So this is the main flux of carbon dioxide due to anthropogenic emissions, so fossil fuel burning. This is an additional flux coming from land use change. This is the flux coming from the uptake of forests, at the planetary level. This is the ocean, and this is the increment of carbon dioxide that we're observing in the atmosphere. The most uncertain part of what we call, this is the global carbon budget, and we have we called it sometimes the missing carbon sink. We're missing some parts of the carbon. So, and the part of the carbon that we have the hardest time to account for is the land use one, okay? If you sum up the errors around how do you use the land, which is, the area of forest lost or converted, and the sink that is due to the action of forests taking up carbon dioxide, we have a huge source of error. So that's, again, what we're working on. So I will now bring you a little bit to Panama. So Panama is a country in Central America. On the western side of the country, it's neighborhood to Costa Rica, and on the eastern side, it's neighborhood to Colombia. And this is work from one of my graduate students. I do realize I forgot his name. Normally, you will see a picture with my students here and their names. So his name is Gerardo Vergara Asenjo. He did a lot of work on, I would say, the protection effect that indigenous people bring to the land and to the forest. So in this map, the blue contours are indigenous territory in Panama, and I will make a little advertising to say that Panama has recognized and given land title, official land title, to 30% of its territory. So well ahead of us in Canada, much better. And then in green here, you have the forest. So this is how the forest looked like in 1992. And I will just go through 2 iterations of this map. Maybe you want to pay attention to this part of the country and look at what is happening with the forest. So 1992, 2000, and 2008. So it's very obvious in Panama that indigenous people are a huge ally to anybody like me who's interested in forest and forest conservation. And I assume that this is why I began to collaborate with many indigenous nations as early as the early 1990s. So I've been trying to be helpful in my research to their concerns and their claims. One of my current graduate students, current PhD students, has been expanding the geographical scope of my lab. And in a study that he published earlier this year, he looked at the effect that indigenous people have on forest carbon stocks across, in Panama, of course, but also in many countries across the Amazon basin. And what he showed is that, in fact, indigenous tenure, which is the left column on the graph, is as efficient at protecting forest carbon stock as is protected area, and that the utmost protection, so the places in the Amazon and in Panama where the forest is the best protected and where the carbon stocks are the more intact, is where you have an overlap between indigenous tenure and protected area. So it's kind of a double layer of protection. So it's not just in Panama that indigenous people are an ally to those of us interested in forest, carbon, and biodiversity. It's very much something in the neotropics. As Charles mentioned, I served as a negotiator at the UN Convention on Climate Change for 7 years in the name of Panama, and that was certainly one of the most exciting things I've done in my career, and that made me very aware of the world of policy. So my research, I'm interested in that research having an impact on national and international climate policy. I'm just dying for us to really stand up and really take the decisions we need to, however hard they are, to ensure that our grandchildren will have a decent life, because we're really fighting climate change. So my love, I would say, in Panama is the Darien region. So the Darien region is the easternmost part of Panama. And as you can see from this map here, in green is forest, and in red is active deforestation. So the eastern part of Panama is where deforestation is the more rapid. It's a land that is the traditional land of 3 different indigenous nations. One of them is the Embera Nation, with whom I work currently a lot. It's also the end of the road. So maybe you know, or maybe not, that you can take a car in Alaska and drive to Tierra del Fuego. So Tierra del Fuego, Terre de Feu, I don't know in English, the fire land, I don't know, the end of Argentina. So you can drive from Alaska to the end of Argentina, but you cannot cross Panama. The road stops about here. And that's it. From there on, rivers are your way around. So I find that's quite nice to be working, as you see here on this image, which is my National Geographic content. You go to Yavisa, which is around here, and that's it, the road stops. So if you've driven from Alaska, that's it, you cannot go any further. Also, the Parque Nacional Darien, so Darien National Park, which is positioned in this portion of Darien, is the single largest national park of Central America. So it's really a region of very large, very intact forest for very, very, very many square kilometers. So that's my playground. And that's where I'm inviting you today. So I will be showing you and talking to you about the difficulty we have at estimating the carbon in a forest. So for somebody like me, a tree, half of the weight of a tree is carbon. So if you want to know how much carbon there is in a forest, well, of course, the easy thing to do is you chop the wood, chop the tree down, weigh them, and then you can calculate. But of course, if you're interested in the conservation of forests, you will not harvest your forest in order to weigh your forest. So we need to find indirect way to estimate how much forest there is. And there's many different ways out there to do that. So one is having inventory plots. So you go in the land and you establish some plots, and then you track the trees, you measure their growth. And from that, you calculate, the flux. So how much, trees are dying, so that emits carbon, trees are growing, that takes up carbon. There's new methodologies like terrestrial or LiDAR, laser ranger. So I'll talk about that later. So precise camera that capture the tridimensional structure of trees, and they allow you to cover a broader landscape than inventory plots. And you can also monitor the carbon cycling with infrared gas analyzer over a forest to try to understand the forest uptake. The bottom line, though, is look at that. The net emissions from these estimated from these methods are so variable that we don't know. So colleagues that work on global model are saying that we know less about the carbon balance of tropical forests than about the moon. So it's very problematic when you're trying to understand what's happening to climate change, to be unable to understand better the tropical forests. So I mentioned the LiDAR. So the LiDAR is a sort of like an infrared, like when you go to the cash register and you have this light, a red light that reads the price of your item. So it's an infrared detector, in this case, an airborne LiDAR. So you fly over a landscape sending these infrared, and you measure the time it takes for the signal to rebound. So if your signal hits a tree, it's going to rebound more rapidly than if the signal hits the ground, okay? So from that, you are able to reconstruct in three dimensions what the forest looks like, and in theory, to get very precise estimates of carbon stock. So in Panama, we had the pleasure of collaborating with scientist Greg Eisner, who's very famous with airborne LiDAR. When he came to work with us in Panama, he was at the Carnegie Institution. And here you see basically a part of his sampling strategy. So with his airplane, he was flying over Panama, making north-south transects. The transect were now north-south because the south is drier and the north is wetter. So he wanted to capture sort of the difference in forest types. So this is the map that we published based on the airborne sampling of Greg. And you can see that the Darien region where I work shows up as the one with the highest carbon stock. But here, if you look at the scale is constrained between, zero, almost no carbon in this region of the country, which is largely cattle ranching. and 130 megagram or ton of carbon per hectare. So when I saw these numbers, I realized that the estimates of carbon are constrained with the calibration data that we give to the machine. So 130 megagram of carbon came from the Panama Canal area, where the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute has very intensive monitoring of forests. And so basically that determined the maximum carbon that the LiDAR could see. So I decided to take another approach and to go under the flights of the LiDAR with Indigenous collaborators to actually verify or measure the carbon in the forest, to provide, a ground truthing for the LiDAR mission. So this is the slide where the nice people at University of Calgary are supposed to show you my video. I suppose for that I need to stop sharing, so I will pass that on to them and be back. It's always much nicer when I'm not the one that have to deal with the technology.
Yeah, just give me a sec. We'll have it right on.
Yeah, and just a reminder you can put your questions into the chat box for later, and we're building up a curated list there. So looking forward to an interesting discussion.
I guess, that little video will in part answer Nicolina's answer of how we can involve Indigenous people in research. So.
In the context of climate change, there is this huge interest to stop deforestation. And again, if Indigenous people in Panama, they control 60% of primary forests, they will be key actors for this, agenda of conserving the forest. So about 3 years ago, we started a large program of training of technicians, Indigenous chiefs and technicians on this proposal. It's a big territory, 200,000 hectares.
Sí. Suena bien.
Last year, a scientist from California, Dr. Greg Eisner, he flew over this landscape with a plane and he measured carbon with what we scientists consider probably one of the most advanced technology. Cada equipo tiene flagging tape, cada equipo tiene la cinta diamétrica y una wincha. Entonces, jefe de equipo, tú agregas tu cosa y tú lo distribuyes a tu gente. So we're currently establishing the line along a plot of 1 hectare that correspond exactly to 1 hectare that has been measured by the LiDAR plane, because we want to validate the data of the LiDAR with the people from the community, because for them, in order to actually believe that this plane that takes data from the sky is taking data that are meaningful, they really need to see a part of that for themselves. And then within that forest, measure the height of trees and their diameter, as well as the species identification. 55.8. These are the 3 elements that we actually need to estimate the carbon, the above ground carbon stock, as we say it.
64.1 altura.
We're sort of acting as a bridge between this really high-tech technology and their belief system and their understanding of their own, forested landscape.
Thank you for that. It makes me feel like I so much want to go back to the field. I guess I'm not the only one, am I? Okay, so I need to find back my slide where I was. I was here. Share again, and then we're back. So, so what we've done is develop a methodology that is a very encompassing. We start with, talking with authorities, traditional authorities. They choose technician. We try to do workshops for communities to understand what we do. And then, we train local indigenous technicians to use and do all of the elements of the work, all the way to, calculating carbon and identifying, the trees and so on, so that we build an understanding of the carbon that they have on their landscape. So one of my PhD students actually developed the methodology and worked with indigenous technicians to measure carbon in 38 1 hectare plot, distributed around the Darien region. It was, again, fully participatory, but I think we learned certainly as much from our indigenous partner as they did from us. So the learning, is everything from their understanding and classification of forest and how to use different plants, all the way to access. So we began to look at the forest differently because we work in very remote landscape, but for them it's not remote, it's their backyard. So they understand the forest in a way that no scientist can ever understand it. So it's been a really fantastic journey. And the results we found were very surprising to us. I think we were very thrilled with them, and it was only the beginning. So this is the average biomass. So for you to relate carbon and biomass is twice higher than carbon. So it's the average biomass of those plots in Darien when the forest was intact. And then this one is the average biomass of plots where we saw some signs of intervention, very mild intervention, but harvesting of some trees. So a few things about this result. The map we got with LiDAR, this airborne technology, maxed out at 120 ton per hectare or megagram per hectare. If you would put that on the scale of biomass, that would be 260. Well, what we found is well above 400. So when we actually got in the field with the indigenous technician, we found much more carbon than we were able to detect with this airborne surveillance. The other thing that's exciting about this result is this is a higher amount of biomass than most other plots that have been accumulated over the years in the neotropics. And in the yellow circles, these are plots in the Amazon. So we like to say that Darien is as good or better than the Amazon. And it compares, we all know that the Asian forests are the highest one. They're dipterocarp forests up to 70, 80 meter tall. But the forests we found were very similar. So we were pretty gung-ho from that result, very exciting. And then we also have something similar when we look at the number of species per hectare. And we see that of the plots that have been extensively studied in the neotropics, we rank second in terms of diversity. Clearly, Yasuni in Ecuador, that's the mecca for tropical ecologists, the highest diversity in the world. But compared to other parts of Panama, the best studied forest being the Barro Colorado Island forest, or elsewhere in Colombia or Puerto Rico, the Darien forests are clearly very species rich. So that brought me to organize an expedition and begin to further explore ancient forests. My question was really, do ancient forests keep accumulating carbon. People tend to say after about 200 years, that's it, there's no more carbon. But my instinct looking at the data was that that's not true, and that if you could find forest sites that were really off from human impact, their carbon stock would be even higher than those that we had measured. So we turned to one particular tierras colectivas, so indigenous territory, very far in Darien. As you see, we have a border all the way to Colombia, so you can see the position here of our playground. The previous expeditions, we had gone only to the main village on that indigenous land, and they were telling us that the best forests were further into their territory. So we did set out to go and visit that. And I did put this as a reminder to let you know this is not an easy place for fieldwork. We are just near Colombia, so there is a lot of narco traffic. So when we do the field work, we have to be heavily guarded by Panamanian border police. So it's not a place for wimps, my team is saying. So what we did here is we went in the communities and they brought us to what they considered the best ancient forests they had. And in each of these ancient forests, we established 2 plots of about 30 meters by 30 meters, so a little less than 1/5 of a hectare in each sampling unit. It was not random sampling. We chose the forest to be ancient forests. And we had 2 methods of sampling. So we had the terrestrial LiDAR scan, so similar to the airplane one, but from the ground up rather than from the sky below. And then our usual, not high-tech tech, measuring tapes and vertex. And when we calculated the carbon stock, so this is, we did 10 sites, 20 plots. And then when I calculated those carbon stocks in red, or, those biomass, this is carbon. So when I calculated the carbon stock, one of my PhD students told me, you made a mistake because we had results of 2,000. Remember, we started with the 130. So now we're an order of magnitude more carbon. And then we recalculated and recalculated, and sure enough, there's no mistake. So we really found these ancient forests to be extravagant in terms of carbon. And that carbon, or the huge value of that carbon, tends to be largely explained by the presence of big trees. So in blue is the carbon of those same plots when you take out the few giant trees that exist in that forest. Just to give you a scale, because for you maybe 1,500 tons of carbon per hectare, maybe it says nothing, right? So just to scale, this is Quebec. You're in Alberta, so you probably like to see that things are not so good in Quebec. So this is the scale of the carbon in the Quebec forest. So the biggest forest we have only 80 tons of carbon per hectare. The average is around 40 for much of southern Quebec, where we have the most developed forests. So compare 40 in Quebec and 1,500 in this region of Darien. It is just another world. And that's why. So here is my friend. I like this tree. This is one of my best friends. When we went there, this tree had just recently fallen over the river. So we were able to fully measure it. So here is my crew. So we were 20 people standing on this tree. This is a LiDAR scan of the tree, and here are the LiDAR team to give you a scale, okay? Well, this tree alone is 50 tons of carbon. So this tree, one tree, has more carbon than 1 hectare of forest of southern Quebec. Well, so of course, if you are in a forest where those big trees are abundant, the carbon of the landscape just skyrockets. A little bit of an aside, my initial question when we went out there was to look for ancient forests. So we were guided by the Indigenous collaborators, but we are scientists, so we wanted to see if that was true. So to do that, what we did is we dug some pits and we went down to 80 centimeters to collect soil. And in that soil, we looked for phytoliths. So these are little structure of kind of glass that are found in the leaves of plants and they don't decompose. So with that, some paleontologists are able to go back in time and date the forest, you know, as the history of the forest. And we looked for signs of human disturbance like fire, plants that have been used for agriculture forever, like maize or some grasses. And we found no evidence in these forests for human presence. So we really were working, or we really are working in ancient forests. Another proof of that is some dendrochronology. So we took a slice of that big giant that was fallen on the river, and we were able to extract a part of it. We were not able to go to the full center. The tree was too big, and we were able to date this slab, and this is about 230 years. So we know that this tree is well over 200 years because we haven't gotten to the core of it. Again, a proof that those forests are very old. So then the question was, okay, these patches of very high density, large trees, how abundant are they on the landscape? Because since we were looking for ancient forests, these ancient forests happen to be characterized by giant trees. And so we've been since then searching for giant tree on the landscape. Here is how we could do that if we would have full coverage of airborne LiDAR. So all these red dots are trees above 50 meters in altitude. So the current work we're doing is trying to combine remote sensing and terrestrial LiDAR to identify big trees. We've had some success. For example, look at this triangle here. This is the giant tree that fell over the river. And from the sky, this is on Sentinel-2. We were very clearly able to see the tree. And here again, in October 2018, we can see the tree. And then in December 2018, we see the trunk. So we know exactly that the tree fell between October and December 2018. And we met that tree in 2019. So we've turned now to artificial intelligence. We're collaborating with a colleague at McGill, David Rolnick, and one of his master's students, trying to train computer to identify these big spots on satellite imagery as big trees to be able to calculate them on the landscape. So we're not artificial intelligence. What we've done is looked at many such images. And on this map, this is the region where we work. All the trees, the dots in red with a number, there are big trees, 240, I think, in this map. And I've actually went to verify and validate about 90 of them. So we know that we're working on a landscape where these very big carbon stock and these very giant trees are abundant, and we're in the process of trying to improve our estimates. And to end my two last slides, I believe, so all of this work since before its beginning has been done in collaboration and with the full participation of the Embera people of the Balsa River. And we're aiming at establishing an old growth forest observatory there. So a place where Indigenous technicians would be able to collect the data for scientists, with the scientists or alone, and to be able, therefore, to help us understand those ancient forests. As we've been doing that, we've played a very active role in trying to help them obtain their land claims. So the papers for the land claim have been submitted to the government of Panama in March. And so we're now excited that maybe because of our help, they could have their title to the land. And the work I do would not be possible if it wasn't for the exceptional people in my team, and they're the most important one to acknowledge. So if we want time for question, I think I'm better to stop here.
Great, wonderful. Thank you very much for that really fascinating talk, Catherine. So we have a couple questions, and we could jump in quickly. Certainly, on NSERC's radar and other research organizations, the issue of working with First Nations has increased through time. And I'm wondering, people would likely be curious in terms of like, how did you get your start as they look at their own programs and their own lives and think about, how they might genuinely engage?
For me, I think it was maybe a bit out of serendipity, I think you say in English. It just happened. I went to Darien because I had heard about Darien out of curiosity, and my mind was blown out by the Indigenous people that welcomed me. And when I arrived there, I was a biologist and I was concerned with the forest. And when I left after 2 weeks, I was a biologist concerned with conservation, but fascinated with the Embera culture. And as I went back and back and back, I became certainly as concerned with Embera culture as with the conservation. Mm-hmm. And I think that the ultimate difference, or there are two places where scientists still need to grow a lot. One is Indigenous people are more than technicians. Yes, you can train them for technician, you can show them your part of the knowledge, but they have knowledge of their own that is equally valuable, and that you need to fully appreciate and not try to verify. It's different knowledge. Mm-hmm. They understand things differently. And for me, the real collaboration only starts once you've really accepted that and you agree that they change your own mindset. So they need to be there at all time to decide, how you work and what do you do, and in full respect. And I think this is still, this is hard. People still have difficulty with not validating their knowledge around ours and not letting them take the leadership. So I think this is what we need to do. For us, it's clear that we're welcomed on their territory. We serve as ally. We don't pretend that we always are interested in the same things. We tell them this is our interest, then they tell us what is their interest, and from that we collaborate.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, perhaps very, very quickly, just there's one question in the chat box here. So how would you see, in terms of, as this appropriate solution or better solution, planting new forests with species selected by scientists versus local communities concentrating on stopping deforestation?
So in terms of immediate help to the climate, it is more important to conserve standing forest than to replant. Because if you plant a tree, even in the tropic, it's going to take, decades before this tree is a good store of carbon. Whereas if you cut a tree that is big, you immediately release that carbon in the atmosphere. The problem we're having, and it's probably the challenge I would like to tackle in the last year of my career, is we don't have a financial mechanism to pay for avoiding the deforestation. So we have good mechanism and handle to pay for replanting for carbon, but not to pay for, you know, avoiding the deforestation. So it's very irritating that we don't.
Yeah, a neat question by Brent. I know I'm keeping you longer than we planned to, but he asks, are you worried about exposing the number and location of big trees in terms of their long-term protection, or you know, people that may want to predate them?
So I don't think so, for two reasons. Well, so we don't give the precise geographic location, but the general area is inside National Park Darien. Just to get to the main village where we work, it's 12-hour dugout canoe. It's very inaccessible. It's inside a national park, and it's inside an indigenous territory. So it would not be impossible, but it would be hard to understand. Also, I'm more concerned, and I'm not disclosing information on the animals that we see on the camera traps, because I find that is more a threat. Because in this forest, we have documented every, you know, like super endangered animal that we did not even know still existed in Parque Nacional Darien. But that I find is scary, is a bit more scary.
Yeah.
But for trees, it would be a long shot that anybody would go to harvest them, I think.
Far, and the local communities there, so yeah.
Yeah, and the local community, if they chose to cut them, I would say that's their right.